What about the fact that you're fat and stupid?
Yeah.
You absolute son of a bitch.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 230. We're going to be doing something that we haven't done since episode 192, and that is covering the recorded output of a single man. In that case, it was Lassipuka from Hooded Menace, Claws, Phlegethon, all that stuff. This time around, it's Ari Honkonen.
야, 나를 완전 제대로 잡아.
I mean, that is kind of a good question. How come both times I've done this, it's been like a Finnish guy? I mean, yeah, there are a lot of bands I like from Finland, but there's plenty of stuff that's huge that comes out of Finland that I don't like at all. You know, like Nightwish. I'm sorry to the guy that was really nice to me on the comments for the Versailles and Camijo episode, saying, you like Versailles? You should give Nightwish another shot, okay? I gave it another shot. I couldn't do it. I don't know. I don't even really have a good explanation for it, because some of that stuff really isn't that far off from what Versailles does. I guess Camijo is just way dreamier than Taria.
You some kind of homosexual?
But let me tell you something about this Ari Honkonen guy. You're gonna find something to like from this dude, because he's got a bajillion different bands. He's got Phenoman, Percola, Angel Jesus, Morningstar, Herliani, Preparedit, Sepil Merman, Nordman, Mtor, Skinboy, Testator, Hard Devil, Thor's Hammer, not the Polish one, or the American one, Warmall, Arska, 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 and Iron Bird, and Minotauri. And that's not even all of them. And they're all spread over a wide variety of genres, too. There's black metal, doom metal, thrash metal, neo-folk, folk metal, speed metal, old school heavy metal, rack, oi stuff. Basically, he's like the Grousome Kite guy, but instead of drug addiction, it's weightlifting. Basically the kind of stuff the kids these days should be listening to. It's kind of tricky, though, to figure out where to start when someone has an output as voluminous as this. I mean, I've actually known about this guy's shit for years. Like, one of my friends has been trying to sell me on him for going back at least 4 or 5 years now. And I've had other people bring up certain projects to this guy on podcasts I've been on, but I didn't really know where to start with these guys until a couple weeks ago. I was at sort of like a cookout party type thing. We were listening to music, and I finally got around to giving this guy's stuff a decent chance. And now that I've gone through pretty much everything he's recorded, or at least all of it that I could find, I feel like I have a pretty good basis for getting you started down the Ari Honkonen road. This road starts way back in the early 90s, when he was the primary songwriter and driving force behind one of the earliest Finnish black metal bands that not a lot of people have heard of, called Morningstar. Now, when you think of early Finnish black metal, early 90s Finnish black metal, you probably got something playing in your head that sounds a lot like... with a bit of a accent to it. I'm sure that's what Ricardo over at Wild Rags thought he was getting when he signed them. I wonder if this is going to be like another Beherit or another Impaled Nazarene or an Archgoat.
No, it's not.
Those bands, they play something that nowadays is usually called war metal or bestial black metal. If I were to come up with a genre name for what's going on that first Morningstar album, Rivendell, I would say it's barbaric black metal. Specifically, Robert E. Howard style, philosophizing barbarian black metal. Very Conan. Hell, it has a surprising amount of aesthetic commonalities with the second Gates of Slumber album, despite the fact that that band plays a completely different genre. It has a very thick, bassy guitar tone, and speaking of bass, the bass guitar itself is very audible, not just in a black metal context, but for any kind of metal. Listen how loud that shit is. And it also maintains a very similar sort of rollicking, ramshackle cadence to a lot of the music, which was also an important part of Suffer No Guilt, my favorite Gates of Slumber album. But it's not all just this sort of classic mid-paced heavy metal thing that happens to have a black metal vocalist yelling over it. This is definitely black metal. You can tell with the sorts of chords that he's using, this sort of spooky dissonant type shit, moving around inside bar chords, utilizing a whole lot of spooky keyboard type shit, and even some black metal style double bass drumming. The songs tend to be very short, almost like little punk song structures. They rarely go over 3 minutes. Coupled with that epic heavy metal songwriting feel to it, it's a pretty unique album for 1994. Not a whole lot sounded like this at the time. At this stage in their career, Morningstar had an interesting knack for utilizing little sort of like calm down moments and then the big old speed ups to lend a real sense of like the epic to what would otherwise be, you know, very short, punky, punchy song. It also helps that the riffs are like super memorable because of that classic heavy metal influence. I don't really see much talk about, honestly, any of Ari Honkonen's projects online, and when I do, it's usually about his more well-known later bands like Heathen Hoof and Minotauri, and when I even more rarely see people talk about Morningstar, it's usually people talking about Morningstar in the context of those later projects, and the prevailing opinion amongst internet scumbags seems to be that Morningstar doesn't really get good until later on, when they start sounding more like the later Ari Honkonen stuff. I disagree. This first Morningstar album, Rivendell, is actually my favorite. Not to say that the other albums are bad, but this one just really has a unique atmosphere to it, and it's also kind of all over the place stylistically in a very interesting way. It's got a few of these more laid-back sort of interlude-style tracks, but they're not just sort of instrumental intro-outro filler. They're songs in their own right, and they do really cool stuff. Like right here, this is probably pretty close to what we would call a fusion of black metal and dungeon synth nowadays. Back in the day, it would have been, hey, that guy's doing cool stuff on the keyboard, and the guitars are thick and full. The drums are just very minimalist timpanis and cymbal timekeepers. This guy was definitely into Bathory, but you could say that about a billion other bands. The important thing is Ari does interesting stuff with that Bathory influence that I haven't really heard other people do before. But for those who got into Morningstar after going through the Minotauri back catalog, that are looking for a little bit more like sort of doomy type stuff, there's plenty of that shit on here too. And that's where it really does sound like the band Gates of Slumber a whole lot, which is interesting because that band wouldn't start for another 4 years after this album came out. But the aesthetic crossover is there with that really thick guitar tone and the loud bass and just the overall barbaric atmosphere. It's still unquestionably black metal, but black metal of a very doomy stripe. I absolutely love how scummy that guitar tone sounds. Most of the album is pretty darn mid-paced, but it does pick up and enter more conventional fast black metal territory at points. That sort of thing would become a much larger component of their sound on the second Morningstar album, Heretic Metal, which came out a year later. If Rivendell was barbaric black metal, Heretic Metal is maybe moving forward a little bit in history to the medieval era. I'm not saying it's quite Abigor, but you'll see what I mean. In terms of tempo, this is much more conventional 90s black metal in that it's fast as fuck, but it still stands out very much from black metal at the time with its focus on these very triumphant melodies and that right-hand guitar technique, which is much more kind of like spastic and jangly, almost very similar to what you might hear in Argus Lent. Speaking of Argus Lent, check out this heavy metal section here. Does this not sound like something they might have been listening to when they were writing Galloping Through the Battle Ruins? In all likelihood, this is much more of a coincidental aesthetic similarity, much like they had with Gates of Slumber. But still, it's interesting. And here's what I mean when this album goes medieval. It's not, quite to like the Summoning or Abigor level, but the keyboards on this are much less dungeon synthy and way more like something you might hear on an Abigor album. But the guitar riffs under it aren't like those wacky neoclassical shreddy leads. Instead, it's very good old-fashioned heavy metal influence stuff. That's probably why that part we played earlier sounded a little bit like Argus Lent. I'm guessing both of those bands were huge into Running Wild. Check this part out here, dude. We got some of that bass from the first album coming in fucking strong. Dude, check out that Eye of the Tiger bass line. What is this, Rocky 3? Hey, woman! So overall, this is a fantastic and unique black metal album. I don't like it as much as Rivendell, but it's still top-tier stuff. And that would continue on their third album, simply entitled Hell, where they brought in those same 80s heavy metal influences, but did something very different with them. For starters, this is where the already noticeable Manila Road influence really takes over. With the very triumphant galloping guitar riffs, the weird usage of flanger on the guitar there, as well as the fact that they're writing songs specifically about metal. This one is entitled Heavy Metal Heretic. That's very Manila Road. Another cool relic from the 80s that is reinvigorated on this album is a massive amount of thrash metal, something that wasn't really part of the earlier Morningstar albums at all, but is all over this release. This band is all about sort of undertaking a massive heavy metal renaissance within a black metal context. They play black metal, but they're bringing back all of these older styles of metal in a black metal style, and that really was not in vogue in black metal or a lot of metal in general when this album came out. And with that, we sort of enter the second half of Morningstar's career, and I demarcate this as the second half, not just because there's 3 more albums after this, but because whereas over the course of each of the first, second, and third albums, there's a massive style jump, the fourth, fifth, and sixth albums all kind of adopt a consistent style, and it's a very good one. Pretty much all the trappings of black metal are excised apart from the darker atmosphere, and yet the guitar playing and songwriting style is still distinctly Morningstar sounding. This particular song, Electric Battle Cry, off of the first of the more heavy metal sounding Morningstar albums, is kind of interesting in terms of sharing an aesthetic commonality with another band, that being Scald, who I covered on episode 187 of this program. So you can add that to the list of bands that Morningstar ends up sounding like mostly through influential coincidence, along with Argus Slent and Gates of Slumber. The final 3 Morningstar albums, Weight of the Hammer, Kalevala Mysticism, and Finnish Metal, all sort of exist within the same aesthetic space of kind of darker, gloomier, gothic heavy metal with a bit of a black metal edge to it. As I mentioned earlier, it seems like a lot of the online fans of Ari's later projects tend to prefer this era of Morningstar. I myself, as you could probably tell by the running time of this episode, prefer the earlier albums a little bit, but later day Morningstar is still highly effective heavy metal. Particularly on the final of those 3 albums, that being the aptly titled Finnish Metal, which is definitely the closest Ari Honkonen has ever gotten to just straight up sounding like Bathory, with the heavy incorporation of those kind of shimmery bar chord riffs and usage of acoustic guitars, very much in the Hammer Hearts, Twilight of the Gods mode. This album would be the final full-length effort from Morningstar, and it marks an effective capstone. I mean, it's called Finnish Metal, for God's sakes, and that's what Ari Honkonen and compatriots lived and breathed for years and years and years. And it is on these albums that you can hear some really good lead guitar, which is what you're listening to right now. That's great stuff. Again, it reminds me a lot of Scald for some reason. That sort of lead guitar playing would become even more important for the next major Ari Honkonen project. And this one might be a little bit more well-known to more casual listeners of metal. We are talking about Minotauri, who play a variety of doom metal that very much picks up where the later Morningstar albums left off. Interestingly enough, Minotauri actually started as a band not that long after Morningstar, and they put out lots of demos and singles throughout the 90s. They were actually contemporaries with Reverend Bizarre and ended up doing a split 7-inch with them later on. But the first Minotauri full-length did not come out until 2004, the same year as the final Morningstar full-length. And, I mean, it's a great album.
But I have a comment
regarding some of the extra musical shenanigans going on with this album. You see, the original version of this album has one of the greatest album covers of all time. It has a big spooky skull. It has a castle that's either burning down from the inside or else maybe like a cloud is raining a firestorm on it. And it has elf tummy, which I know all you internet sickos are into. Hey bitch, I got a large heart on you can collide with. Oh! But yeah, it's basically a perfect album cover, 10 out of 10. But when it got reissued by Nuclear War Now Productions, it just got like the worst album cover ever. I mean, this looks like a bad Electric Wizard knockoff or something. I don't know if they like lost the rights to that painting that was on the original or what, but man, is it ever disappointing. That said, the music contained therein on any version you get of this album is fantastic. See, I told you that lead guitar was going to become a lot more important in this project. It's an interesting sort of synthesis of Quorthon, Bathory style leads and Tony Iommi bluesiness. This song in particular, Black Chakras, I find to be interesting because it shows off 2 different styles of doom metal that Minotauri excels at. This one right here is this more sort of like rollicking Witchfinder General-esque mid-paced doom metal stuff, and it's going to collapse very heavily into the super slow shit. Both varieties of doom metal present in this song give off a near perfect microcosmic presentation of what Minotauri is all about. Essentially, doom metal of the 90s variety, but with no stoner stuff at all. All the stoner shit has been wrung out. Instead, it's just old school. and very dark, with more than a little bit of a hint of black metal going on, particularly during chord changes like this, where he starts utilizing some much weirder, more wandering kind of intervals in his chords than would be normal for a 90s retro doom metal act. It really makes sense that Reverend Bizarre would want to do a split with these guys, because this fits right in with their whole philosophy of total doom, no stoner shit at all. The second Minotauri album is actually a pretty effective capstone to this episode, because it basically goes back to that heavily barbarian influenced aesthetic that defined the first Morningstar album. And accordingly, that means it sounds a whole lot like Gates of Slumber, which means that I fucking love it. The vocals are a lot gruffer this time around, and the songs aren't as like gothic and morose. They're much more triumphant and barbaric sounding. It's probably my favorite of the two Minotauri albums, although the first one is no slouch either, as you heard previously. Check this part out here. Awesome Bathory-esque bar chord usage for a wide, expansive sound. It even has samples of like thunderclaps. How Wagnerian. Unfortunately, there's only the two Minotauri albums. They're both excellent. But fortunately, this is not the end for our coverage of Ari Honkonen's oeuvre, because you saw how many bands I listed off earlier. So stay tuned for a sequel to this episode where we'll go into what he's been up to more recently. Until then, I'll see you. Thanks for watching. Bye.
I don't have sex with girls. I would rather die than do that. I might also just be gay, although who the hell knows in these increasingly strange days.